Monday, we started out this week, we were talking about kind of being in social media hell because Senator McCain died and there was a shooting in Florida. And just I couldn't help but notice how the social media just goes through the same thing again and again. And I said the reason I think that we keep getting in the same arguments without ever moving off the dime is because we're not really arguing about what we're actually arguing about, which is freedom, which is about liberty. One side of us believes in the founder's vision of liberty. We believe the country was built for the express purpose of protecting our liberty, that the Constitution is there for that reason, that the whole machinery, this whole, I call it a Rube Goldberg machine of all these different parts kind of in battle with each other, the states against the feds, the Congress against the executive, the judiciary against the Congress, all these things, these balances of power in this machine were built to preserve your liberty, to keep the government so busy fighting each other that they're not coming after us and hampering our rights and taking our rights away. As I'm watching the news now, I'm just thinking, like, not only are we not arguing about what we're arguing about, but there's no such thing as a news story anymore. The story is not the story. The story is always the agenda. You know, if you go back into the 40s and 50s, you'll listen to liberals, and they've been talking about this now for, 50 years, 60 years, talking about the Red Scare. Go on Google and Google movies about the Red Scare or movies about the Blacklist, okay? And you'll get movie after movie. The Front, you'll get Good Night and Good Luck, Guilty by Suspicion, Chaplin. All these pictures, all these films are about the following thing. There were spies, Soviet spies, American Soviet spies in the State Department at a very high level. And Harry Truman got a lot of them out. But still, that when they were exposed, it was exactly the same as today. When Alger Hiss was exposed, the press was like, this is a wonderful, liberal, upper-class person. Why would if you ever want to read a great, life-changing book about this, read Witness by Whittaker Chambers. Whittaker Chambers was the kind of overweight, sloppy, former Russian spy. I think was he gay? I don't know. I think he was married. I can't remember. But he was a sloppy, kind of not very classy former Russian spy who exposed Alger Hiss in the State Department, and the press jumped on Whittaker Chambers. Hiss was eventually convicted of perjury. It was a big deal. So there actually were Russian spies at the very top levels of American government. But then Joseph McCarthy took the fact that there was this threat of Soviet spies. These were people who believed that the Soviet Union was the future, that communism was the future, that this was going to solve all the problems that they had had during the 30s with the Depression and all that. It was all going to change once the wonderful communist system came in and helped us all out. And so they became spies thinking that they were doing the right thing. Joseph McCarthy came along and he turned this into, as they always call it, a witch hunt. That doesn't mean there were no such thing as witches. There were communists at very high levels, but that doesn't mean McCarthy was a good guy. McCarthy was a demagogue. He played off people. People's fears. He played off the fact that everybody was afraid that the Russians were coming. And, what he would do is he would say he had evidence of, had names. He would wave a closed envelope, and he would say, I have evidence that there are these spies in the Army, in the State Department, here and there. But he never produced the evidence. In fact, we have a video of him. This is cut number 7. Play cut number 7, a video of Joseph McCarthy saying there's evidence and then coming up with nothing.
The Russians offered help. The campaign accepted help. The Russians gave help, and the president made full use of that help. And that is pretty damning, whether it is proof beyond a reasonable doubt of conspiracy or not.
Do you know of any instance where the Russians said, we're going to do it this way, we're going to do it through WikiLeaks, we're going to do it through DC Leaks, this is how we're going to get this information out there?
I can't comment. That is an issue that we have been investigating, and I don't want to comment at this point or not what the state of that evidence is.
Sorry, that wasn't Joseph McCarthy, that was Adam Schiff. But same difference, same thing, right? They're just using the Russian scare to get people afraid and work their political will. And the story is not the story. The story is the agenda. That's what you're seeing. When you see the Russian collusion story, you're seeing an agenda. You're not seeing the real investigation into, Russian meddling, which I'm sure is going on. So one of the things that happened, and this was not Joseph McCarthy, but because McCarthy was a senator, but over in the House, they had what was called HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and they began calling up anybody who had ever had any kind of communist leaning. And it was unfair because people, intellectuals and even working class people thought, oh, this wonderful communism has come. Somebody once said, I've seen the future in the Soviet Union and it works. And so people joined these communist clubs. But as the stories of Stalin's atrocities came forward, people got wise and they saw what it was, and they saw what the left always is, which is this controlling, overbearing, tyrannical philosophy that wants to force everybody into a vision of goodness, even if it means killing tens of millions of people. A lot of people left, and so it was kind of unfair when the House Un-American Activities Committee would call them up and they would say, they would call them before Congress and say, you were a communist, now name your friends who are also there, name people. So it forced you into the position of being a rat. And it was overdone. It was, too much. It was too much an overreaction to what was actually happening, the fact that there were actually spies. And it happened in Hollywood. So it happened in Hollywood, and they went after some guys writers and actors and producers and directors who had been who had been communists. And people started getting blacklisted, right? So there was this blacklist. You couldn't work because you were a communist. And talented people, Dalton Trumbo, a terrible human being and an absolute communist, but he was a terrific writer. He wrote Spartacus under a pseudonym, great film. But there were guys who said, you know what? These communists are bad guys, and I'm going to testify. I'm not going to go to jail. I'm not going to, ruin my career. And guys like Elia Kazan, who was one of the great directors of the 50s, Bud Schulberg, a really good writer, they testified. And people started to ostracize them once the blacklist sort of went away. And they made a movie. It's one of the classic films of all time called On the Waterfront with Marlon Brando, in which Marlon Brando plays a dock worker. The docks are owned by the mob, and it's about will Marlon Brando testify against the mob. And what Kazan and Schulberg were saying is, hey, sometimes ratting people out is the right thing to do when they're really rats. And so all this stuff has gone on and on forever. The horror that people in Hollywood were, God forbid they had been Nazis, then nobody would worry about it. They were communists, which resulted in far more deaths than the Nazi regime. The communist regime murdered far many people. But, that Hollywood was silenced, they were furious about it. But the story was never the story. It was never about the fact that people were silenced. It was about the fact that they were silenced. It was never about the fact that HUAC overstepped its bounds or Joseph McCarthy overstepped its bounds. It was always about the fact that they wanted to sell leftism, and they got caught hooking their wagon to the star of the Soviet Union, which was an oppressive, murderous slave nation, slave empire. And they got caught, but they still wanted to push that agenda. Now they're doing the exact same thing, and they're simply reporting it from the other side. They're trying to gin up fear against the Russians, just like the right did, just like Joseph McCarthy did in his day. They're trying to gin up fear against the Russians to silence conservative voices and overturn the voice of the people who elected Donald Trump. And Trump is talking about it, and he is ticked off that Google and Facebook and Twitter are silencing conservative voices. And he said so. Google, the head of Google, has refused to testify, but the other social media guys are going to come to Capitol Hill and testify. And Trump said this is a problem yesterday. Here he is talking to the press.
Yeah, I think Google is really taking advantage of a lot of people, and I think that's a very serious thing, and it's a very serious charge. I think what Google and what others are doing, if you look at what's going on at Twitter, if you look at what's going on in Facebook, they better be careful, because you can't do that to people. You can't do it. We have literally thousands and thousands of complaints coming in, and you just can't do that. So I think that Google and Twitter and Facebook, they're really treading on very, very troubled territory, and they have to be careful. It's not fair to large portions of the population. Okay?
So the point is here, right, that they're doing exactly the same thing that HUAC and McCarthy and all of the Red Scare people did in the 50s, and that they've been complaining about for all this time. But all those complaints, all of history as told by the left is not history. History is not history. It's the agenda. So the guy from Google comes out. His name is Nick Sokrasek. and he's like Google's product manager, and just gives this po-faced denial that there's any chance that Google is slanting their searches in favor of the left, which they are certainly doing. But he just looks right in the camera and says, nope, not happening.
Search is not used to set a political agenda, and we don't bias our results towards any political ideology. We continually work to improve Google search, and we never rank results to manipulate political sentiment.
I mean, I've made the comparison before, but it is like the Martians in Mars Attacks who say we come in peace as they blow you away. Of course they are. Now, look, part of this is left-wing prejudice so baked into our communication society that they don't even see it. So, for instance, they're going to privilege mainstream outlets. They're going to privilege the New York Times. They're going to privilege the networks. They're going to privilege CNN, which they consider mainstream. Those are all far left. I mean, the New York Times, when I call it a former newspaper, I'm not kidding. It is a far left vehicle. It is a vehicle that promotes socialism. It's a vehicle that rewrites the communist atrocity, the atrocity of the Soviet Union. Almost daily, they try and sell you the idea that it was nowhere near as bad as you thought it was. And by the way, if you were reading the New York Times, where they buried the story of the starvation famines that Stalin purposely caused that killed something like 10 million Ukrainians, where they buried it in the New York Times, maybe you wouldn't have known it was as bad as it was. But these were people who signed on to communism, who never quite bought. They told you that it wasn't a communist who killed John F. Kennedy. They've been lying about it forever, and now they continue to lie about it. They're a left-wing newspaper. They used to be a newspaper that slanted left. Now they are a left-wing rag. And so when you privilege those things, you are automatically privileging left-wing information, but that's not the half of it. Eric Weinstein, he's the guy from Thiel Capital, very bright guy, says the denial from Google is ominous. Google regularly biases searches in countless political ways: anti-gun, pro-multiculturalism, etc., anti-extremist. According to many experiments I've run, it does so in a fashion that is so transparently obvious as to be comical. I have found this too. I mean, James Damore, the guy they fired for saying men and women are different. I mean, that's a punishable offense at Google. They fired him for saying that. The big study comes from the Media Research Center, which you can get. You go on Media MRC, and you can download their entire study. Something like 40 pages. Talks about the fact that Twitter, we know, is shadow banning. Project Veritas caught them shadow banning conservatives. Facebook's trending feed has been hiding conservative topics, and we saw that egregious attack on our friend Dennis Prager and that whole absolute. I mean, they're so dishonest. Why not just come out and say, you know what, we got to straighten this out? Why not straighten it out? Instead, they say, oh no, it's just a mistake. We just happened to, ban all of Dennis's videos. Google search, especially as you come into an election. See, this is the thing. They don't care. After the election, after November, they'll be happy to kind of make it fairer, a little bit fairer. YouTube, of course, we have problems with YouTube every day. They demonetize our videos and they say how controversial they are, but they don't do it. Do they do it to the Young Turks? They don't, do they? No. Yeah, and they don't take them down. If I use material from an entertainment source, they will cut us down. They'll say, oh, you violated copyright. They never do it to the left. And they rely on these groups that hate conservatives to do their fact-checking for them. The Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League, these are all guys who think that we are hateful because we believe in the Constitution and because we believe in liberty. There's even, at Facebook, there's even now a movement. James Barrett was writing about this on our own Daily Wire. There's a movement against their culture. Here's his story. He says, on the same day that President Trump unloaded on the political bias problem among major tech communities, including Google, the New York Times published a memo penned by Facebook senior engineer Brian Amerige, laying out the company's problem with political diversity and calling for a movement within the company to promote more tolerance of people with political views other than just the leftist views he says are currently enforced by employees. Since he posted his memo last week, dozens of fellow employees have joined this movement. The memo is titled, "We Have a Problem with Political Diversity." He says, "We are a political monoculture that's intolerant of different views. We claim to welcome all perspectives, but are quick to attack, often in mobs, anyone who presents a view that appears to be in opposition to left-leaning ideology. We throw labels that end in OBE and IST at each other, attack, like you're an Islamophobe or you're a racist, sexist, attacking each other's character rather than their ideas." So if they're having a movement within Facebook to stop it, it's happening. I mean, that's a big clue that it's happening. So just going back, we know now to look at all of the history, the way the left has told it, and say, wait a minute, what was the real story? Doesn't mean the story is the opposite. It doesn't suddenly mean Joe McCarthy, who was a drunk and a demagogue, doesn't mean he was suddenly a good guy. It simply means that the Red Scare, there wasn't a phobia. It wasn't a phobia. There were Reds in the State Department, and the left tried to cover it up. And some of the people who got caught up by HUAC and by McCarthy deserved it. Some of them were actual communists working in the government and in touch with Moscow and in touch with people who wanted to turn this into a communist government. Some of those people still, their descendants, their intellectual descendants, still working both in the government and in the news departments and in the academy. And, every story is like this. I mean, it's all about what I was talking about on Monday. It's all about whether you believe in liberty or not, whether you're trying to get people so upset about some other story, whether you're trying to use the story so upset that they'll give up their guns, give up their constitutional rights, allow the Supreme Court to write law instead of the legislature, allow the president to use his pen and his phone, as Obama was fond of saying, to make law instead of the legislature. It's all about breaking that Rube Goldberg machine that protects your freedom. And, everything they do is like Trump the other day is talking to Christian leaders. And there was a tape that was put out, and CNN and NBC both say they have heard this tape. And Trump is trying to get the Christian evangelicals behind him for these midterms that are coming up, because he's afraid that people will support him, but they won't get off their duffs and go to the election booth to vote for other Republicans. And he's saying, if you don't vote for Republicans, if I lose the Congress, if I lose the House, if I lose the Senate, we're going to lose my agenda as well. So he's trying to pump people up. And he says to them, this election is very much a referendum on not only me, it's a referendum on your religion, it's a referendum on free speech and the First Amendment, it's a referendum on so much. And he said it's not a question of like or dislike, whether you like or dislike the candidate, it's a question that the Democrats will overturn everything that we've done, and they will do it quickly and violently. And violently, there is violence. When you look at Antifa, these are violent people, okay? So the left goes nuts, right? And when I say the left, what I mean is the media. And Chuck Todd, remember, Chuck Todd brought on a Antifa supporter, a guy who had written a book, the Antifa Handbook, I think it was called, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, brought him on twice to promote his book, to promote his point of view. And now he's shocked, I tell you, shocked that there is violence going on in this casino, that Donald Trump is making reference to violence. Chuck Todd is shocked.
He's trafficking in this part of the Republican base. It's not fair to call it the Republican base, although that's what it is now. But I think, in fairness to you,
Trump voters.
The Trump voters, he's trafficking in their conspiracies.
Yeah,
and he touched Antifa, an issue in Portland, Oregon. Okay, I will grant you that, and in some places, but this is not a giant issue.
This reminds me a lot of his initial reaction to Charlottesville. This desire to talk about violence on the left as somehow equal to or perhaps greater than violence on the right. Or
to rationalize violence.
Right.
I think he just wants to rationalize violence.
Yeah, that's it. Donald Trump is just rationalizing violence, but violence it's not a big problem. It's not a big problem on the left. I mean, have you seen what happens on campuses when conservatives try to talk? Have you seen what happens where, all of these riots, even the riot in Charlottesville would not have happened if the left had just let like the 5 right-wingers who show up for this stuff, and I call them right-wingers, but they're not. They're the white supremacists, let's call them, the 5 or 10 or 20 white supremacists who call it. If they just let them go and laughed at them, none of this would happen. Antifa is the source of a lot of this violence, and a lot of this street violence is from the left. All those Seattle riots that take place, all those anarchists, those are leftists creating that violence. When you saw the way the Tea Party showed up and they had their meetings and they cleaned up after themselves, and then you saw the way Occupy showed up and they had rapes and they left filth all over the place, and yet the press said this is wonderful. And so the problem, what Chuck doesn't realize is the problem is not Antifa, the problem is him. The problem is him. The problem is mainstream guys in ties and jackets sitting on TV with the power of that camera in front of them saying, it's fine. It's fine. It's not the same. Here's Don Lemon. I got to say, the guy's a brick. Here's Don Lemon, a living brick, telling us that there's a big difference. This is cut number 2. Big difference between Antifa violence and other violence.
says it right in the name, Antifa, anti-fascism, which is what they were there fighting. Listen, there's, no organization is perfect. There was some violence. No one condones the violence, but there were different reasons for Antifa and for these neo-Nazis to be there. One, racist fascists. The other group fighting racist fascists. There's a distinction there.
It really is as if a guy in a white sheet showed up and burned a cross on a black man's lawn and said, "I'm here because I'm anti-Klan." What difference does it make what you call it? But people name things that the wrong things all the time. But for Don Lemon, boy, if you say you're anti-fascist, and you put on a mask and hit somebody over the head, that's different violence. That's the problem. The problem is the condoning of violence from these guys, because the story is not the story. The story of Donald Trump saying, there's a problem with violence on the left, that's not the story. The story is hiding the fact or rationalizing away the violence on the left because you are for the left.